What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 19 of the Chat It Up podcast. Have a really great episode for you guys this week, especially because I'm in such a great mood. Now, why am I in such a great mood, do you ask? Well, that's because my Michigan State Spartan basketball team just beat the Michigan Wolverines, and not only did they beat them, but they beat them in Ann Arbor, so I'm in a pretty good mood right now. So if you're a Spartan fan out there, go green, go white, and if you're not, well, sucks to be you. So if this is your first time listening into the podcast, my name is Shooter, and this podcast is about all things Upper Peninsula of Michigan. If you're a loyal listener, welcome back, and thank you for sticking with me. Speaking of the Spartans, this week I'm interviewing a Spartan by the name of Dave Nyberg. But before we jump into all that, we've got to do our segments. I definitely don't want to neglect those. I've been getting a lot of great feedback from you guys on these segments, so I'm going to just kind of keep running with them. So we'll start things off with Uper News. That's right, you heard that correctly. Uper News, as I'm calling it. Again, if this is your first time listening in, Uper News is headlines I've seen over the last 2 weeks that I feel are unique to the UP, or maybe they're just interesting or entertaining. So my first headline for Uper News is this past weekend was the 26th annual Trinary Outhouse Classic, which is outhouse races. If you've never been there, it's basically a huge party on the main street in Trinary, Michigan. The participants, basically what they do is they build outhouses and they put them on skis. And a lot of times they decorate them, or there's a theme. The participants usually wear costumes and such too. And one by one, they basically push their outhouse down the main street in Trinary as fast as they can. I believe there's a cash prize for the top 2 finishers as far as the fastest times. But they also, I think, have some prizes for some other different categories as well. But really, at the end of the day, it's a huge event and a really big party every year in the hometown of the legendary Trinary Toast. So big tip of the cap to all the organizers and everybody involved in that, because that's definitely a very unique and special event for the Upper Peninsula. My second headline for Uper News is one that we've pretty much all been talking about for the past month, and that's this damn snow. Holy wah. Hickey Lunta certainly has been dancing up a storm for the month of February. As of this past Thursday, the U.S. National Weather Service in Marquette was reporting on Facebook that 67.5 inches of snow had fallen for the month of February. And, you know, currently there's a blizzard that's whipping around outside of my house, and that easily has dropped probably another foot of snow. So we're definitely well into the 70-plus inches of snow. Now, that report from Thursday, they also said that we are 42 inches above normal, and this is the second snowiest February that they have on record. The title for the snowiest belongs to the year 2002, where we got absolutely drilled with snow. That February, we got 91.9 inches of snow. You know, I'm a bit torn about all this snow because I know that it's really important for the economy of a lot of towns in the UP, and I know that they're having really good years because there's a lot of snowmobile traffic and skiers and snowboarders and winter enthusiasts, so that's all awesome, but at the same time, all of this snow has just been draining as hell for me, I'm not gonna lie. You know, don't get me wrong, I love to snowshoe and ice fish and get outside as much as I can this time of year, but it feels like each storm that we've had lately has dropped like at least a frickin' foot of snow. And to be honest with you, I'm running out of places to put it or throw it with my snowblower. So I don't know, I just feel like I'm constantly shoveling off my deck and my stairs, and hell, I even had to get up and shovel off my roof. I mean, if somebody out there knows Hickey Lunta or has a connection or anything like that, reach out to him and let him know that enough is enough as far as I'm concerned, as far as all of this snow. All right, let's move on to the next segment, though, which is This Day in Uper History. That's brought to you by our good friends over at Pasty.com and the Pasty Central Facebook page. So without further ado, here is This Day in Uper History.
Pasty Central Day in History February 25th. Inventor Samuel Colt received the patent for his revolver on this day in 1836, which was also the year the state of Michigan agreed to give up the Toledo Strip in exchange for the Upper Peninsula. Born on this day in 1873, legendary tenor Enrico Caruso, who would one day find his way to the Upper Peninsula to perform in the Calumet Theater. Finally, this day in 1940 brought the first televised professional hockey game, as the New York Rangers beat the Montreal Canadiens 6-2 at Madison Square Garden. It was a sport which marked its beginning 38 years earlier in Michigan's Copper Country with the Portage Lake Professional Ice Hockey Team in 1902. Pasty Central Day in History, February 25th.
Thanks again to the folks over at pasty.com and the Pasty Central Facebook page. That's pasty.com, and once again, that was This Day in Yooper History. All right, now it's time for this week's interview, which I mentioned before is with my friend Dave Nyberg. Dave is a super interesting guy, and I met him quite a few years back with my involvement in 40 Below, which is a local young professionals organization, which now they are known as Connect Marquette. They've recently done some rebranding, and you know, those of you loyal listeners will remember my very first interview was with Bugsy Saylor. And Bugsy has this knack for kind of always being a part of these big things that are going on around the UP and especially Marquette County. And Dave is the exact same, but with Dave it's more from the like public policy and inner working standpoint. So I like to say that Dave is basically Bugsy meets bureaucracy in a way. That's the way I would describe Dave. But I'll stop blabbing on about it, and I'll let our interview do the talking. So without further ado, let's chat it up. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with a good friend of mine and also a loyal listener to the podcast, Mr. Dave Nyberg. Dave, thank you for coming on the podcast with me today.
Thanks for having me, Scott. It's really cool to be on the podcast. I'm a big fan of what you're doing here. So,
thank you. So we'll just jump right into things here. So you grew up in the Gladstone area, correct?
Right.
Okay. Now, were you born in the UP, or did you move there at a young age?
It's a dirty little secret.
But I remember you telling me that one time, so that's why I'm bringing it up. It's not dirty.
So I'll come back to so I can go back to the third generation Yooper piece of my Gladstone story. But I grew up in Gladstone. My parents actually my dad and mom kind of did what I did when I turned 18. It's like I got to get out of here and do some different things, and they moved down. My dad worked at a place in Howell, and he was worked for a place called Diamond Chrome. And they were very young. Mom had me at 19 years old and very young. And my dad ended up deciding, a couple years later, he wanted to buy into the family business, which is a small business in Gladstone. Sure. And so we moved back up there. I moved to Gladstone when I was 8. And some of my friends that I made my first week. And so I graduated Gladstone High School in 2000. And it's kind of a funny story. Like my great grandfather was the town blacksmith. Like I mean, it's how more. It's like Gladstone was a new town, and everybody kind of had their trade. And my grandpa then grew up in Gladstone, went away and served in World War II, and became a tradesman and worked at Harnish Figure in Escanaba, and ended up starting this lure manufacturing company.
I was going to say, you kind of glossed over it at first. You said, this family business. I was like, this business is a pretty big deal. I'll let you continue to explain this lure business.
Yeah, sure. It started out as a hobby. These guys like to fish for walleye and little bait and auk, right? Okay. And so is my grandpa and his brother Carl, and their two buddies, the Applegren brothers, and some other friends, I'm sure. And my grandpa, he was really good with metals and made dyes, and he knew how to work with machines. He was a mechanic in the U.S. Navy, and so he went to the Dunwoody Institute in Minneapolis to fine-tune his trade skills after the war. And so they were making their own fishing lures, and they caught fish. And it's actually modeled after an old Scandinavian jig lure. And so they started making fishing lures. They found out what worked, and they started a company, and it's it's still there since 1955. Now my dad's a partner in the company with his cousin Anders.
Sure. But the claim to fame, the thing that everybody has heard of, is the Swedish Pimple.
Right. I guess I should say the name. It's the name of the company is Baden & Lure Company, but one of their famous products is the Swedish Pimple.
Everybody knows the Swedish. If you're a fisherman, you know what a Swedish Pimple is.
Right. Swedish Pimple, the Dujigger, the Vingla, and Pimple actually is kind of a funny name, right? And that's actually a big part of their branding. I mean, it's just the name sticks. Everybody knows what a Swedish Pimple is. And pimple is the Swedish verb to jig.
Right.
So I'll have to share with you after the interview. There's a great interview of my grandpa with CNBC, like back in the economic downturn. They were doing stories on businesses that were thriving during the downturn, and they told, I actually never knew it, and I saw it on TV, and I was like, that's cool. It's a cool
That
story.
is very interesting. Yeah, you'll definitely have to share that with
Yeah.
me. So what was life like for you, though, growing up in Gladstone in, the late 80s, early 90s?
It was really great. Actually, some of the episodes that I remember listening to early on when I started becoming a fan of Chat It Up reminded me a lot of your stories that you talk about with your friends, just kind of freedom, riding your bikes everywhere. We actually, my buddy Craig and Bob and I, and Craig's brother Tater, we invented this game called three-man baseball. So we had our own rules, and you knew where a home run was, and you knew where a double was, and it was a pitcher, a catcher, and a batter, and we had our teams, and we played legit sandlot baseball until somebody bought the lot and put a house on top of it. So then we moved the sandlot to Craig's backyard.
There you go.
So I mean, typical kid stuff, 90s kid. We'd ride our bikes up the cow path, the bluff, and we'd get in lots of trouble. We'd go down to the lake and go swimming in the summertime. We'd do a lot of fishing.
Was Tater's name really Tater, or is that a
Tater?
nickname?
No, Tater. His name's Brian LeClaire.
Okay. Everybody's all about nicknames. I feel like that's a UP thing. Everybody's got nicknames.
Yeah. So Craig LeClaire is the name of my friend. I should say when we moved to Gladstone, it's kind of terrifying to move to a new town when you're 8 years old.
Right.
I distinctly remember Craig and his white hair knocking on my door. I think the first or second day I lived in Gladstone, he lived a block away. We've been best friends ever since. And his older brother is Brian, and they're both super awesome, talented athletes. And Tater especially is a good baseball pitcher. Went and played college ball and stuff. But yeah, Tater, he got the nickname, I think, at infancy from his parents. So
now, were you around the business at all growing up? I mean, I know you said your dad's now a partner, but as you were growing up there, were you kind of in and out and doing stuff around the business?
Absolutely. I was always in there. I was always hanging out and talking to it's kind of split into like the manufacturing floor, where they're making the product.
Sure.
Everything with the Swedish Pimple starts from a piece of brass to a finished product, and there's I don't even know what, 20 steps or so.
Sure.
And then there's the packaging area, which is different, and there's mostly women working there, and they sticker the lures, package the lures, put the hooks on them, and I'd toggle back and forth between talking to the ladies, and many of them I knew. Some of them were my aunts. Craig's mom, Karen, was in there.
There you go.
And but then it was my first. Doesn't say my first job was a paper route. But then I think the law at the time was when you were 14, you weren't allowed to work for a paycheck, but you could work if it was your parents' company. So at 14, I remember I couldn't. I was bending Dujiggers at the Dujigger bender. And as a matter of fact, a couple years ago, when Governor Snyder we were doing something completely different at Bessie Forest Products, and I said, my dad wants to. It was around his birthday. I said, my dad wants to give you some. He's a fisherman. He wants to give you some lures for your birthday. He's like, why aren't we? Can't be that far from here. You're in Gladstone. And I said, we ended up going to the shop, and I was able to show the governor where my first real job was. It was kind of cool. So and then when I turned a little bit older, I got on the buffing wheel. Buffed a lot of knuckles, buffing pimples.
Yeah.
Well, so I was around the shop a lot.
I'm glad that you mentioned Governor Snyder, because we're definitely. I want to talk about the path that kind of led you to working for Governor Snyder, because it's a really interesting story. I mean, you headed down to Michigan State and you studied law. Was it always your plan to kind of go into law when you headed down to Michigan State? Or, I mean, I guess, how did that
Not really. I grew up a Michigan fan. I had a surgery at a young age at University of Michigan Hospital, so I kind of naturally grew up rooting for the Wolverines until I went down for something in high school as a leadership conference or something. It was my sophomore year, and I was at Michigan State. I absolutely fell in love with Michigan State's campus. And right then and there, I decided I was going to go there. I wanted to get out of Gladstone, experience the world a little bit.
Sure.
And I was an undecided major.
Yeah.
Didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I kind of figured out, I thought maybe I wanted to go to law school as a business major at first.
Yeah.
And then I changed, and I ended up going to law school, Michigan State College of Laws, but I did it part-time in the evenings, and I worked full-time.
Okay.
And the relationships I built kind of through my career in Lansing led me to a bunch of interesting opportunities. I lobbied for a conservation organization. I worked for actually a guy who lived from Michigan, who lived in Gladstone, Steve Mitchell.
Okay.
Has a consulting firm in East Lansing. I worked for him throughout college, and
Yeah.
Worked in the state house for House Speaker in the legislature. And those experiences kind of really reaffirmed my interest in public policy, and specifically related to natural resources and law, public policy law. I decided to go to law school, but I didn't really know for sure. I liked the jobs that I had, so I wanted to go part-time.
Yeah.
And so it took me a little bit longer to finish than usual.
Sure. So it's funny. I'm glad that you mentioned working for the House Speaker, because that was one of the things that I had listed here. It was Craig DeRoche that you worked for, right?
Yep, Speaker DeRoche.
Yeah. So how did that whole thing come about? I mean, that's a pretty prestigious thing to kind of be a part of. Can you walk me through that a little bit?
It's all about relationships. So Steve actually, I was looking for an internship like my sophomore year in college to get some experience. I was really interested in public policy and the legislative process, and Steve introduced me to Craig. He's a freshman legislator at the time, just got elected.
Sure.
And he took me on as an intern. Actually, my first day was his third day in office.
Oh, wow.
Now knowing kind of what I know about the legislative process, like how green he was, but I just was just in awe to be able to work at the Capitol for him. He's a cool guy. And I ended up working on his leadership campaign. He decided he was going to run. It's an interesting process in running for leadership when you're in the legislature, and Craig decided to run for speaker. And so I did a lot of campaigning, and I did a lot of work to get people elected that year. And I interned for him for 2 years, and ultimately he got elected speaker by his colleagues in the Michigan House, and he asked me to be on his staff, which is pretty rare for a 21-year-old kid to have a job in the speaker's office.
That's what I was saying. It's a pretty big deal. That's what,
And I didn't really fully appreciate at the time how I did, but I didn't quite fully, right? And I worked as a legislative assistant, so I was the guy who, and again, I didn't appreciate it at the time. I kind of felt like a paper pusher, but I was the kid that took all of the legislative ideas in, and I was kind of the liaison between all of the policy experts in the House and the lobbyists and the legislative director for the speaker. So I was kind of the connector of ideas that came in the door, and kept track of all of the bill ideas as they got drafted, called bluebacks. They turn into, they get sent over to the Legislative Service Bureau, gets drafted into real bills, and they get introduced. And so I was really able to drink through the fire hose of the legislative process.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds
that time,
like
and
that's a lot going on.
And that kind of, it reaffirmed my interest in what I was doing, but it also kind of reaffirmed that I needed to get more education, and I didn't want to be a legislative staffer forever, so I decided that kind of the intersection of public policy and law is where I wanted to spend my career, and I went to law school, Michigan State. So
go green.
Go white. Yeah, for sure.
So I guess then my question for you is how did becoming a part of Governor Snyder's team really kind of come into focus for you? I mean, I know that you moved kind of back up this way around like 2011, and I don't want to fast forward through your story or anything.
No, for sure. No, I mean, it was, we lost the majority in the House in 2016, and that's a tough time for, or 2006 rather. That's a tough time. You know, we lose a lot of staff, and I was kind of reevaluating. It was a toxic time in politics at the time too. I kind of realized around that time how much I really hated politics, but I liked public policy.
Right.
And I didn't really know how I identified politically. I was kind of an in-betweener and independent. And I knew that I was interested in natural resources, conservation issues. So I ended up getting an opportunity to go work for somebody who I looked up to. He's a longtime lobbyist and owned a firm called Muchmore Harrington Smalley at the time.
Okay.
And he was taking over a conservation organization called Michigan United Conservation Clubs. They've been around since the 1930s.
Yeah.
They were revamping their focus and their legislative efforts. So I had an opportunity to go work as their legislative affairs manager under Dennis, who was kind of a mentor and somebody I looked up to at the time, and friends of Steve and Mitchell, who I also worked for. And so I went to work for Dennis at MUCC and really gained an appreciation for that process. And as I finished law school, throughout that time, I decided I just wanted to move back to the UP. I kind of was giving up career for place, moved back up here. I had to study for the bar exam anyway. Tracy, my wife, graduated vet school at the same time, and we decided to give it a go. She had gotten a job offer up here in Marquette area, offered Dr. Tim as a veterinarian, and we decided that we're going to take that risk. And so I quit my job, came up here, studied for the bar, and I got a phone call from the governor's office not too long after that from my old boss, Dennis, who is now chief of staff for the governor, and asked me to come on board the Snyder administration. So I did it. It was a great opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, talk about, well, I mean, you mentioned it's all about relationships and the people that you get to meet and the people that you know. You basically uproot and you head up to Scandia and you buy a farm, basically. And,
right.
And then you get a phone call and they ask you if you want to work for Governor Snyder's team. I mean, that's pretty serendipitous in a way, but again, it just goes back to, the connections that you make and what you do. So can you talk a little bit about then what you were doing while you were working for Governor Snyder? I mean, technically you were the director of the Northern Michigan office, right?
Right. So, most governors, at least dating back to Governor Blanchard, have had a UP office or a Northern Michigan office. Governor Snyder, when he took office, decided that he was going to have the role was going to be based in Marquette, but it's a customer service role, but also kind of a public policy role for issues that are particular to Northern Michigan. Mm-hmm. So it was, I did some work below the bridge from kind of like Knuckles North, right, like Traverse City to Alpena and the whole UP. And so I did that. I started in 2012, and then in 2014 I was asked to take an extra role in the governor's legal division to work on natural resource matters, but especially serving as the governor's tribal liaison. So we have 12 tribal governments in Michigan, so working with tribal governments kind of as the governor's diplomat and working with them on their treaty rights and their relationships with state departments, gaming compacts, everything that the state of Michigan has a diplomatic relationship on with tribal governments. So I did that, kind of a dual role, and did that until I left last year in 2018.
Sure. What would you say was the biggest challenge of that role? I mean, you're wearing kind of a lot of hats. Number one, I mean, if I'm just looking at it from like outsider looking in. Sure. But I mean, what would you say was like the most difficult part of managing all that?
Honest time here, right? The biggest challenge, honestly, was, and I don't want this to sound political, because Rick Snyder's he's a pretty independent person. He's not, he ran before he was a politician, which is why I really liked him. And I can tell a story about how I first actually met him when I was working at MUCC, which is kind of a unique one to the UP. But
that's what we're here for.
We'll come back to that.
We'll come back to it.
But I really, I told you, I kind of got jaded by the political process, and I was kind of apathetic. And before I ever knew I'd have an opportunity to work for Rick, I really was inspired by his way of kind of the relentless positive action mantra of governing Michigan without focusing on politics and partisanship. And that's carried forward now that he's left office. He's focused on kind of civility and politics. Yeah. So coming back to your question, the real hard part with that prelude really was people sort of they have in their mind an idea of who you are or who your boss is. Mm-hmm. And so people kind of have a guard up when you're having a conversation with them, or sometimes maybe sizing you up or seeing like if your motivation is really sincere. And that was a big burden to overcome. I'm gonna be honest with you, especially in certain communities in the UP. With tribal governments, that interestingly enough ended up becoming like, it's something I really miss. I really miss working with the tribal leaders and their staff. It was an incredibly rewarding and completely honored to have that job. But it was really hard. Yeah. I mean, you're talking about very serious issues that sometimes the tribes that have fundamental disagreements with the state on, and there's a diplomacy factor there where you get along with who you're working with, but there's serious matters at hand. And that was hard at first, especially working on behalf of the governor, because I think that some people, whether it was working with a business leader or a community leader or a government leader in the UP or Traverse City or a tribal leader or their staff, they kind of thought they knew who Governor Snyder was and who I was. And then until you build a trust relationship with them, you're really not going to get anywhere in a meaningful way. And so that was really the hardest part. And I'm only one guy, it's a lot of mileage throughout the UP and Northern Lower. So
I'd say so.
It was hard. It was hard, and that's the other thing, being away from my daughters, Hazel and Harriet and Tracy, and being on the road a lot. That was another hard part of the job. But I think I'll reflect back in many years and fondly on that job, and
Yeah.
really grateful that I had the opportunity for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it, you bring up a great point of it's a lot of mileage, it's a lot of hats to wear. I mean, so that's kind of like your 9 to 5, and then on the backside of that, you're active. You were at the time active in the 40 below, the young professionals, or now it's not 40 below, Marquette Connect. So I'll drop a plug there.
Connect Marquette.
Yeah, Connect Marquette. That's it. That was where I met you. Was through 40 below, and so between being active in that, and I know you were doing some other stuff. Weren't you doing some stuff for Trout Unlimited as well around that time, kind of? As like their Midwest coordinator too?
So in that buffer time when I was before I worked for the governor, I'd started a LLC called Third Coast Strategies, and really that was just a way for me. I had people calling me asking me to do work for them, kind of in that, government affairs, quasi-legal capacity. And so I did some contract work for Trout Unlimited National, and I did some contract work for National Wildlife Federation, and then Plum Creek Timber, which is now Weyerhaeuser, bought them up, and Michigan United Conservation Club. So, I was doing a lot of work with those organizations. That lasted about 6 months, and it was a lot of fun.
Right.
But I did that for a short period of time while I was trying to figure out what's next.
You can only juggle so many, at one time, but.
Right.
And yet, in all of that stuff, you also found time to be a Stormy Cromer model as well. So
that came a little bit later.
A little bit later, but
talk about a weird. Yeah, this is such a strange thing.
How did that come about? Shout out to Gina. Gina's been on the podcast, so I got to give some love to Stormy Cromer.
Yeah, Gina and Bob are just obviously, as just incredible people. Bob Jackwart and Gina Thorson, and I've gotten to know them in various respects over the years, and we just had a sidebar here from Lizzie Corser at the Oradoc, ladies and gentlemen. So, apologize for the pause. We had a lot of good conversations over the years, and worked on a couple of different projects, including Copper Peak, and so it was just a weird. Gina had reached out and said, "Hey, we like to use in our advertisements people that actually use our products, and real people, and we'd like to know if you and Tracy and the girls would like to be a part of our brand campaign for the next winter season." So we decided to do it. It was fun. So.
That's great. So, all right. So Governor Snyder's term comes to an end. And so then you kind of transition into this role over at Northern. Can you kind of walk me through how that all came about? I mean, was it another situation of knowing somebody or having that connection made? Or, I guess, how did that all come about?
A little bit. So in my role and working, that was another really cool thing about working for the governor is every day is different, and you're always working with different partners.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I had a chance to work with the folks at Northern and President Erickson and his team, Deanna and others, on a variety of projects. And of course, we're all members of the same community here, but specifically the Education Access Network, as that was getting built out.
Yeah.
Northern had gotten their license from the FCC to provide educational broadband throughout the UP. And so I had worked with another friend and colleague who was CEO of the MEDC at the time, Steve Arwood, to say, hey, this is really an innovative way to provide broadband service in an educational way. And we were able to broker an investment partnership that MEDC invested in the AN build out to make it able to go throughout the UP. And so that was one project. The Forensic Research Outdoor Station land acquisition project I worked with Deanna on and DNR. And there were others, but I had built kind of a working relationship with Northern, and it had been made aware to me that Northern was, as part of its kind of strategic plan, developing an office for corporate engagement, which is really meant to be kind of a holistic approach to the way that the university is developing and sustaining its partnerships with businesses and other institutions. So they have kind of a front door policy of who they're working with, and they can make it more efficient and beneficial for them and also for the university. And I decided to apply. I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to come work at Northern. It's a real exciting place to be right now.
Absolutely,
and so that's how it came about. But it wasn't like hey,
Sure.
It wasn't like the other career opportunities I had. So.
Yeah, understandable.
But it all comes back to relationships, as you pointed out.
So to take a step back a little bit, you mentioned a little bit about working with Northern prior to actually working for Northern, and kind of brokering or kind of being that connection to getting the whole internet connection thing that we have going on. Would you say that was kind of one of your highlights for working with Governor Snyder? What would you say was really kind of like your favorite part of? What was the coolest part, or I should say your highlight for your time spent working for him?
Honestly, there were several, and it's hard to pick one. The EAN project was pretty cool because you're talking about like a 9.7, 9.4, I can't remember, $1 million investment aggregate between Northern and MEDC. There were a lot of cool projects to work on. One that really comes back to probably my favorite, and I might go back to that story that I was going to tell you about just to kind of provide some added context. So when I first met, when I worked at Michigan United Conservation Clubs, they had 40,000 members, and sportsman, hook and bullet advocacy organization. They had Michigan Outdoors magazine, Michigan Outdoors television. And so when I was their legislative guy, we had developed this nonpartisan way of saying, hey, hunters and anglers should know what their candidates for public office, how they stand on certain issues that impact hunters and anglers and natural resource conservation in Michigan. Sure. So we would give, at that time, we had invited all of the candidates for governor an opportunity to come on camera and answer some standard questions. Sure. And I'll never forget, I didn't really know who I was going to vote for at the time. Like I mentioned, I was kind of apathetic about the political process at the time. It was kind of a time in Michigan legislative political history that was not a fun time, at least for independents like me. But Rick had come in, and I'll never forget, because he was kind of this like outsider, right? He had come from the business community. Nobody really knew who he was, and he was polling at like 2.5%, 3% at the time. And he came in and he sat down, and I didn't expect him to do that well in this interview about hunting and fishing issues. Yeah. And every other candidate kind of gave the answers you would expect, Yeah. And they did a good job, commendable job. But the governor was asked about what his perspective was on natural resources management in Michigan. And he made it almost all about the UP. And he told the story of, if you think about Michigan's economy from the starting of Michigan as a state and talking about the UP, kind of the phase of resource extraction and settlement, and even all the way back to the fur bearers and trappers, and then resource extraction, the mining and the logging. And then kind of went through this other phase of manufacturing where the UP and our natural resources played such a critical role in, transportation of products. Sure. But he also acknowledged like the legacy of pollution and the impact, because we didn't have laws in place to do that. And he kind of gave this vision of Michigan in the UP, even in northern Michigan, being a big part of kind of a new economy for Michigan and the work ethic. And that just really stuck with me, because I guess I didn't really expect him to. First of all, I was impressed with his historical context. Yeah, absolutely. Was earning bonus points with me and talking about the UP. And so that really stuck with me. And when I worked for the governor, that really never changed. He and Sue, the first lady, really loved the UP, and they would come up here often. They were here a lot in a professional capacity, but also in their own personal time. And when the governor would meet with business leaders, there was a common theme among some of the local business leaders in the region that would say, hey, we're kind of sick of the parochial attitude of, Iron Mountain's out for Iron Mountain and Escanava's out for Escanava, and we need to have one voice. How do we do this? And the governor kind of told this story of like, when I came back to Michigan from Gateway, I had the same problem in Ann Arbor, and he had worked with some colleagues to establish what is now Ann Arbor Spark, which is really kind of a regionally focused advocacy organization that promotes economic development. And he said, I'll help you with that. I'll take my governor hat on, put my Rick Snyder hat on if you guys want to work hard at this. And so they did. And so you had some of the key employers, key CEOs, as well as the universities in the region, kind of banding together and kind of putting down their own personal, regional interest. And so what ended up coming out of that was what's now Invest UP. Okay. So Bob Mahaney at Viridia Group and Steve Hicks at Longyear and Kelly George at M-Bank and Manistee and UP Health Systems, UPHP, and Champion Inc. down in Iron Mountain, right?
Yeah.
The Verettes.
Yeah.
So you have this kind of major group of influencers banding together to say, let's all promote the UP, let's promote our value proposition to the outside world better. Let's invest in that. Let's focus on talent enhancement strategies. Let's focus on business advancement strategies and business attraction. And so that organization was formed, and I had an opportunity to have a role in that. And that was probably as I reflect back, I think one of the most fun and most significant projects that I had an opportunity to work on. But it all comes back not to me. It comes back to having the opportunity to work for a governor who really had a vested interest in the region's future and was willing to invest his time and energy and expertise in with business leaders that had a like-minded perspective on the UP's opportunities.
Sure. So the theme that's kind of come up a few times throughout your story is conservation in the outdoors and a love of all of that. So now you're actually also kind of doing something working with the DNR a little bit, which is pretty exciting. You want to talk a little bit about what you're doing for that?
Sure. I'm trying not to be distracted by the poetry reading.
I know, right? And I'm trying to be quiet. So
we're at the Ordock Brewing and they're reading. It's like a poetry reading apparently that we didn't know about. So no, it's great that we have these cultural experiences here to offer.
Cultured.
It's kind of a full circle thing to the NRC, because when I worked at MUCC, I was more on the legislative side, but it all comes back to what decisions are we making in Michigan that's in the best interest of our resource, and how the resource gives back to people who recreate. In this particular case, the Natural Resources Commission has a challenge by the citizens of Michigan to manage our resources based on science, which was really a big thing back in the 90s that the voters of Michigan pushed through a proposal. And it really takes politics out of the natural resource management process. It's a gubernatorial appointed commission, and I had been asked if I would be interested in serving. And of course I said yes. I was a little bit concerned about the commitments that might come with that. And again, the political issues associated with natural resources management policy, even though it really should be science-based, there's a lot of social science that comes with that.
That's a nice way to put it.
So, but I very enthusiastically, said yes, that I'd be honored to serve. And so I was appointed in October, had my first meeting in October, and I swore in, took my oath of office, and fulfilled the remaining term that was expiring at the end of the year, and then a new term starting this year. So I'm new. I'm one of the rookies on the NRC, and currently the only Upper Peninsula appointee to the commission, which is also kind of daunting. I think there really ought to be at least 2 UP commissioners.
Absolutely.
And, J.R. Richardson just termed off the commission. He had served 3 terms, which was kind of rare. Governor appointed him to a 3rd term, which is kind of against standard policy of having kind of a 2-term limit, just because J.R. was so good.
Okay.
And and JR will still stay active in that. But so I'm currently on the Natural Resource Commission. I was appointed this year by our chair, Vicki Ponce, to the Wildlife and Fisheries Committee, and also the State Parks Advisory Committee. Okay. So I'm real excited about that. And we'll see where it goes. It's we have some very challenging issues on the horizon to tackle, but I'm looking forward to interacting with hunters and anglers to see how these decisions impact them, and then relying on our biologists at the DNR to make informed decisions.
Sure. Would you say that the hunting and fishing that the UP has to offer is really kind of what you love most about the UP? Or I guess
it's certainly a big part of why we wanted to move back here. Me and Tracy both. I like to trout fish. I like to deer hunt. I like to bird hunt. I like to ice fish in the wintertime, of course. I went trapping for the first time with my buddy Matt a couple years ago. We had a beaver problem on the property in Scandia.
There you
Matt
go.
and Joe came out and set some beaver traps and taught me a little bit, learned the ropes on that a little bit. So I really do. I think hunters and anglers pay for conservation, and I think it's a real important responsibility that hunters and anglers are proud to have. But the North American model for wildlife conservation, not just in Michigan but North America, really makes sure that the license fees that hunters and anglers are paying is a benefit of that resource is going right back into habitats, going back into sound wildlife management decisions. And that's really what, to me, conservation is all about. It's all about wise uses of our natural resources, making smart decisions informed by science, and to have one of 7 seats on the Natural Resources Commission to help make those decisions is really, quite frankly, I can't believe I have that opportunity, but I take it very seriously, and
Good.
And I'm glad to be there.
Yeah. Well, I have one last question for you, which you've listened to every podcast episode, so you know what that question is, and that's how do you like your pasty?
Ketchup, man. Ketchup and pepper.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a straight ketchup. I'm always anxious to hear how people phrase this. Maybe some hot sauce.
Okay.
I'm a hot sauce guy.
All right.
But my grandmother, my grandpa Lloyd's wife Adeline, growing up, she was from the Calumet area, and she was Cornish, so she had a very specific way of making pasties, flank steak, and rutabaga, and so I'm a little bit picky when it comes to the crust, of course, and the way that the lard. But yeah, if I'm getting a pasty, I'm pretty much just ketchup.
Sure. All right. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast and also for being a big supporter. One quick story to kind of wrap things up here. When I kind of had first got the podcast first going, I'd gotten a very encouraging email from you that I really, really appreciated. And even more awesome about that was it had connected you and Gina Wallner on that email. I think it was after our episode, and there was a lot of healthy, positive discussion about exciting stuff going on down in Iron Mountain.
That's right.
So shout out to Gina there. But
I'm going to go see Gina tomorrow with a big group of people in Iron Mountain. We're working on a project together.
There you go. So maybe, I don't know if the podcast was that bridge, but I just think it's awesome, that you guys connected. And like I said, I really appreciated that email. But once again, thank you for sitting down with me and coming on the podcast.
Yeah, keep doing what you're doing, and thanks for doing the podcast. I think it's a real big asset to people in the UP, people that live here, but also people that want to tune in and see what's going on back home and listen to some interesting stories. And yeah, hopefully, I'm looking forward to meeting Gina. We've communicated over phone and email since that time, since I heard her on your podcast. And I'm real encouraged by the cool work she's doing in Iron Mountain. And yeah, that's what it's all about. So keep it up.
I absolutely will. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
Okay, it's time for the takeaways from my chat with Dave. The first one is every time I have a chance to talk with him, I always end up walking away from the conversation feeling really positive about the community and feeling really motivated to get out there and step up and help out to make my community a better place. And I think that's really just a testament to Dave, because he's not just talking the talk, he's really out there walking the walk. And he's doing it in a really respectable way that I really admire. I think that's just a testament to his story. I mean, working for the Speaker of the House in the state of Michigan at such a young age, and eventually running an office for our governor, that doesn't happen, just by some off chance. It happened because he stepped up and he got involved and he gets stuff done. So, I think a lot of communities across the Upper Peninsula could use a lot more Dave Nybergs. I wish there were a lot more in this world. So if you feel like you're one of those types of people, then roll up your sleeves, get out there, and continue to work hard to make your community a better place. The other kind of part of that with his story is over the years, he really developed a great network of mentors and connections. And that's my second takeaway, obviously, is the network of friends and connections that you build is so vitally important, especially from a career standpoint. Obviously you need to be good at what you do, and you need to continue to grow as a person and hone your skills, so to speak. But there's so many times where the connections that you make will end up, at the very least, kind of getting your foot in the door, or maybe will present an opportunity to you that you wouldn't have normally had. So that's going to be my challenge for you all this week. If there's any sort of networking opportunities out there in your community, I want you to get out there and go to them and meet somebody new. Shake a hand and say hello and grow your network. Because you just never know where it might lead you. Chat It Up is a bi-weekly podcast about all things Upper Peninsula of Michigan. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe, rate the podcast, and leave me a review. You can also find Chat It Up on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for listening in. I'm your host, Shooter, reminding you to keep your chin up and your eyes forward.